All right, I want to talk about a word that you may not have thought about much that I hope will become your favorite new word. Theism. 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 So if we've ever thought about theism, which we probably really haven't much, we probably assume it has something to do with God or gods. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the Buddhist notion of theism, which has almost nothing to do with Buddhism and almost everything to do with Instagram, with anyone you look up to, with anyone you used to look up to and revile, with how you treat yourself, with your own perfectionism, with your own guilt and shame and self-loathing, if you have any of that stuff. So, theism is a really sexy, hot topic in my little mind, and I hope to make it accessible and interesting for y'all. So, theism. In Buddhism, we talk about being a non-theistic tradition. Trungpa Rinpoche talked about that. He didn't say atheistic. We're not against gods. We're not against God. But we are not necessarily believing in gods or believing in God. We're not against it because, you know, if God walks up to us one day and she says, "Hey, I'm God," and we say, "Huh," and we poke God in the shoulder and they seem to be real, then we'll be like, okay, God exists. We're not going to still be anti-God. But just that the existence of God is sort of immaterial, irrelevant, as we like to say at Elephant Journal, to our daily lives. The Buddha had this wonderful list. I can't quite remember if it was 6 things, but he basically said 6 profound things that don't matter. 6 profound questions that don't matter. And it was like, how big is the universe? How did we begin? Does God exist? It was stuff like that. And I love that list. I feel like the Buddha was a really star blogger back in the day. That's a list that I would definitely click and read on my Facebook newsfeed. So, recently I posted an Ernest Hemingway quote on Instagram. We are a community of writers and readers, and it was some quote about happiness, and it got a whole bunch of likes and hearts and comments, and in the comments it got a lot of hate. And a lot of intelligent, thoughtful people basically said, "Good God, why would you quote Ernest Hemingway about happiness? The guy killed himself." We get the same kind of comments on Sylvia Plath. We get the same kind of comments on Charles Bukowski. I myself wrote a blog years ago about being irritated that people kept quoting Marilyn Monroe about happiness in relationships. The lady was miserable half the time. I had the same point of view about one of my idols, and we'll get into that term idol in a minute, about Jack Kerouac. Like, the guy was depressed and miserable half the time. Why would you quote all these people about happiness? So, I'm a changed man, and now I think you can. I have come to see the light, and the light is that anyone who is human doesn't so much have a right. This isn't some like politically correct diatribe. It's more like has access to basic human wisdom about happiness and depression, and that experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts or confusion doesn't mean that you can't have wisdom about happiness. In fact, that's the only way you can have wisdom about happiness. It also doesn't mean that you do have wisdom about happiness. It just means that you can. So right there is a manifestation of what the Buddha called the middle way, which is it's not one extreme, that the only way to understand happiness is to be depressed. And by depressed, I'm referring to Buddhist notion of depression, which is something all human beings go through. I'm not referring necessarily to clinical depression. And then on the other extreme, you know, only people who are perfect and, you know, have nice yoga pants and pastel backgrounds and their ponytail doesn't have any little hairs sticking out, and they drive a Lexus, and the Lexus was recently cleaned, and they have 3 beautiful children, and the children never seemingly poop in their pants. You know, everything's easy. Only those people, like the Goop Gwyneth Paltrow set, have access to wisdom about happiness. So it's right in between. All of us messy people. Gwyneth Paltrow, my good pal Gwyneth, I call her a big G, you know, she's not perfect, and she wouldn't claim to be. So no one's perfect. And all of us can talk about happiness. We might be wrong. So it kind of really blew me away. I happen to know a lot about Ernest Hemingway, and I said, well, this is the definition of prejudice, right? You think about prejudice not usually afflicting poor old white men like Ernest Hemingway, and I need to come forward right now and admit something myself, which is I am a poor old white man myself. I apologize. But he was paranoid, and as Kurt Cobain said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. He was paranoid for 10 or 20 years. He was followed and tracked by the FBI, as was Martin Luther King Jr. They opened up his mail. Ernest Hemingway killed himself because he had been through 20 or 30 different life-altering accidents. He was in incredible pain. You can read about it. I posted about it, I think, on that Instagram post. And maybe in an article subsequently, I don't know. Maybe we'll put it in the description if we find it. Maybe we won't. And theism is that. Theism is not having faith in us putting it in the description or not. Faith is sort of a bad word in Buddhism. Faith is this notion that you don't really understand what is happening between here and there, so you just assume that it's good. Obviously, for those of you who have a deep relationship to your faith, that's using that word in a different context. Faith in that context means your religion, your path. But faith, in terms of blind faith, is something that we don't necessarily need. So, just to pin this down and make it a little more relevant, the whole Me Too movement is an extreme manifestation of theism. First of all, I'm grateful and excited Me Too exists. I'm not saying that because I'm afraid of people hating on me. These discussions will always involve real topics, and you will always disagree with me partially, and I'll always be wrong partially, but I want us all to have the bravery and the vulnerability to get into these topics, and I'll be doing that with other people who know a lot more than me sometimes, and sometimes I'll just be sharing my own limited experience. But in terms of the Me Too movement, what we see online is a lot of hate, not just in Me Too, but in all of Twitter, in all of Instagram, Facebook, toward other. Whether it's Donald Trump hating on Mexican immigrants or other immigrants, or it's liberal woke folks hating on Donald Trump and his fans. There's just a lot of hate back and forth. And so that's often what we see with theism, is we build people up and then we love to tear them down. With Me Too, there's a particular satisfaction with that. So I'm going to read a little bit and see if I can make some sense of all this stuff. So the first one is about Buddhism as a non-theistic tradition. And we'll put this in the description if we can. Buddha, a non-theistic religion. Is there a God? Maybe. What's more important is being present, genuine, and kind. What do Buddhists believe in? It's a trick question. So this is a quote by the Buddha here. Do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. Do not believe in traditions because they've been handed down for many generations. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it, the Buddha. So I think that connects with, I was just on Instagram and I saw some yoga lady and she was talking about studying in her shala with Patabi Joyce and some others, and there's framed pictures of all these teachers all over the walls, men and women at least, but that's kind of theistic, right? Why are we putting up huge framed portraits of other people? Devotion is a tricky thing. We can have devotion without needing to idolize someone. Idolizing gets a little bit into assuming or prejudice, prejudging. Judging often gets a bad name. A lot of you say judging is bad. I say judging is great. You judge whether you're eating an organic apple, or whether you want to eat an organic apple, or you want to eat a pile of poop. That's a judgment. Prejudging is when you generalize, basically. if you say all black people are bad, if you say all Jewish people are bad, all women are bad, any kind of all white people are bad, any kind of generalization is, frankly, bad. So there's a generalization for you. All right. So the point here in Buddhism is always retain your critical intelligence. As they say, trust the principal one. So when you have a question, like, should I do this, should I do that? You are instructed to trust the principal one. And yes, there's a little funny contradiction there. You're instructed by your teacher to trust yourself. But that's really what Buddhism is about. You're not being taught by a teacher to worship the teacher or even to worship the teachings. You're being taught to be awake. That is literally what Buddha means, awakened one. Do not look for satisfaction outside of one's own heart. And that doesn't mean like to heck with the whole world. That just means you can have all kinds of money and bling and, you know, your cool Ferrari or whatever, but if you don't like yourself, you're going to be miserable in your Ferrari. Trungpa Rinpoche always described Buddhism as non-theistic. We aren't atheistic, he'd say. I already covered this. We don't not believe in gods or God. We only believe in things that we find to be true. That said, if gods or gods show up, we'll be happy to believe. Same goes for reincarnation. We don't believe in reincarnation. Why would you believe in anything where you don't have evidence? If you do have evidence reincarnation is true, then it's no longer a belief. You have evidence. Same goes for kami. Same goes for Buddhism itself. As the Dalai Lama reminds us, he says, if science and Buddhism conflict, Buddhists ought to go with science. Here's a nice quote from Katrina Honigs. When we tell ourselves and others that our heroes are inhuman and on a pedestal that is not just high but unattainable, we are actually pushing ourselves down rather than climbing. And that's what I was trying to get at with Me Too, is we have Louis C.K. up there. He's an idol. We all love him. He's so bad at butt. And then we tear him apart and push him down. Often the people who are abusing, as we're seeing with the Michael Jackson documentary possibly, were abused. You know, often those who are traumatizing others were traumatized as children themselves. That's not an excuse, but we have to look into where this is coming and not just vilify people as evil or as just victims. So this does connect with the notion of cult or theism, for those of you who have seen the amazing series on Scientology on TV with that actress lady. I grew up, here's a little thing I wrote up about my Buddhist community. I grew up in a wonderful community, a Buddhist community, which is currently roiled by long-suppressed accusations of sexual misconduct, assault, misuse of funds, patriarchy, suppression of critical intelligence. Much of the dialogue surrounding this painful yet illuminating time flows through the filter of online hate. But it is this dialogue that is charged with creating a new, better, more open and equal society for those who wish to meditate and study together without subjecting themselves to trauma. So, how are we going to create a better society if all we're doing is hating each other? Right now in Boulder, a police officer approached a black man who was attending Naropa University. He's in his front lawn picking up trash. He has some tool to do so with. And the police officer calls for backup, and apparently 4 more police officers came, and they even had a gun drawn, at least one. And there's a video of the whole thing. So that's an awful, horrifying incident, right? Is it about racism? Is it about the tool that was in the guy's hand? Is it a mix of both? Is it a miscommunication? Is it a call for retraining the police corps? There's a lot of questions that need to be asked. But often what happens online is just, you know, the story becomes that Boulder is super white, which is true, and Boulder hates minorities, which may or may not be true. Hopefully it isn't completely, but obviously we have some work to do. And it just becomes yet another incident of kind of hating on the hater, instead of learning and teaching and creating, constructive moments as a society together. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about a lot. He said, I've deeply thought about this, and basically hate is kind of a non-starter. This is the incredibly ineloquent version of what he said. He said, I've thought about it, and hate doesn't work. I have to stick with love. Hate is easy and satisfying. When you get treated badly at a restaurant, you love to hate on the waitress or waiter for a second. It feels good to be angry. You feel powerful, but ultimately it doesn't make a more just society. Whatever our situation, nationally, worldwide, or in local community, we depend on journalism and honest, respectful dialogue to establish truth and progress. Never undervalue independent media, please. Yet another plug from Waylon Lewis for independent media. Okay, and then the other article I thought I'd read really quickly. This podcast is going to, fail because basically it's Waylon reading his blogs to you. Buddhism is non-theistic. So this is something I wrote when the Karmapa, who's this big famous Buddhist guy, super handsome, all the ladies and all the guys go gaga over him. Oh my God, handsome, powerful Buddhist guy. Oh, and I worship him. I want to bow to him. Buddhists love to worship other Buddhists, which is ridiculous. We're not theistic. So I wrote this right after his visit. This was probably 10 years ago. As a lifelong Buddhist, everywhere I look in Buddha land lately, covers of Buddhist magazines, posters for sales, cards, photos in Buddhist gift shops, I see the handsome, wise, young face of the 17th Karmapa staring out at the horizon. Okay, I get it. He's a powerful, well-trained young man. He embodies the fragile future of Tibetan Buddhism. In his previous incarnation, the 16th Karmapa, who I knew when I was a little kid, was a big deal. A powerful teacher who my parents' teacher, Chugam Trungpa Rinpoche, a powerful teacher in his own right, was himself genuinely and most humbly devoted to. But last I checked, Buddhism is non-theistic. That means we don't go looking outside for salvation. That means we regard the Buddha as inherently no different than ourselves. That doesn't mean we are Buddha. That means we have Buddha within. So as Pema Chodron says, your wisdom is like the blue sky and your neurosis is just the clouds blocking out the sun. So it doesn't mean that you're perfect and everything's set and you don't need to do anything. There's a path and you have to work hard. The Buddha himself said, look, I don't have anything to teach, I'm nothing special, I'm just human. Literally, he attained enlightenment and he didn't want to teach. All his friends were like, come on, Buddha, tell us what happened. And finally, he talked about the Four Noble Truths. He said, so they said, please show us the path that you've discovered from suffering to sanity. And he said, okay, here you go, meditate in this way, contemplate compassion, blah, blah, blah. But when I see my parents' generation smiling like fools and bowing to the ground, I wonder where the dignity has gone. Talk to the Karmapa, be interesting and interested, that's devotion. This groveling stuff was, in my experience of his visit to Boulder, boring. A lot of the most secure people emotionally who are stars in some way are bored by adulation. So when I first met Richard Freeman, who is a yoga teacher, I hosted him and Cindy Lee, another wonderful yoga teacher, up at Shambhala Mountain Center when I was the head of the program development, which was a nice big title because we had no programs, so literally I was developing the program situation. We had some Buddhist programs. We had no public programs. So I invite Richard Freeman up, and this lady comes up to him at the end of the course and is like, Richard, you're so wonderful. And I just remember the look on his face. He was just bored. He wasn't rude about it. He talked with her. He was nice. But he wasn't interested in feeding that. And a lot of, the whole influencer Instagram generation, it's the opposite. You want to keep that going. You want to build that fire up to a roaring bonfire until you're so powerful and so mighty that fancy hotels in Thailand will host you for free on a big, reed swing with your hot boyfriend or girlfriend. That's the goal in life. When really our goal in life should be to be of benefit to the whole world before Thailand, is underwater because of climate change. So from a Buddhist or Shambhala point of view, we're all kings and queens of our own lives. I think my mom called me a prince a lot when I was a kid. Not to build up my ego, but to give me some sense of joyful kind of, dignity, elegance. Treat yourself and your surroundings well. She taught me I was intelligent, and therefore I became intelligent. I don't think I particularly was or wasn't, but she said, she was a teacher, she said, you're really good at this reading stuff. She just encouraged me, and pretty soon I was like, oh, I'm good at reading, so I'm going to get through this tough problem. And then I was good at reading. So, as it says in Shambhala, Sacred Path of the Warrior, a wonderful book by Trungpa Rinpoche, sit like a mountain, work with one's discursive mind, work for the benefit of others, and we'll all experience a vajra, a brilliant, indestructible-like humbleness, a humbleness full of dignity, and absent of groupie-like idol worship or cult worship, cult of personality worship. So I'm not going to read anything else. That part of the boring Sunday sermon is over. But I think we can apply theism to a lot of things in life. Whenever you idolize someone, remember that you only idolize their use of their platform to be of benefit to others. So for me, that's been really helpful. If I ran into Brad Pitt at the grocery store, I'd be like, "Sup, Brad? Loved World War Z," and I'd move on, who cares? I honestly don't really care. But if I ran into George Clooney, I'd be like, "George, oh my God, I love you." Because George has paid for a satellite to patrol the border of, now I'm going to forget, if I were President Bartlett on West Wing, I would remember. But, in Africa, 2 warring nations where there's a lot of war crimes going on. He's done some good with his platform. Same with Robert Redford, same with Paul Newman, donating 100% of profits to Hole in the Wall Gang, which serves terminally ill children and turns their sadness and isolation to joy and some sense of rest and being a kid. So, I do idolize, I do look up to those who use whatever platform they've created to be of benefit. And that's what I want to do in my life. But and I would encourage you to look up to people who do that. Look up to heroes, whether they're rich or famous or good looking or not, who cares? All that matters is if they're serving their community and your community and other communities and bringing people together, and that's exciting. Because talent is sort of God-given, which is kind of an insult if you think about it. You didn't really earn it. But working hard and being a benefit to others, that's something you earned. So, I don't think there's very many people I admire on Instagram, quite honestly. There's a lot of people I like. There's a lot of people I have some sense of warmth for, and that's great. But there's not too many people I really look up to. And often looking up to people makes you feel awful, right? You look up to a couple in the park, having a picnic, and you're like, why can't I just have a nice relationship, I'm sort of making fun of myself, but that's really what we all go through, right? So, yeah. And what else? I think that about covers it. Basically, the whole phenomenon of building people up, putting them up on a pedestal, and then tearing them down with hatred, when really you're just hating on your own idolatry, but you don't get rid of your idolatry. I remember years ago I kind of slightly refereed with the whole John Friend fiasco at the time. He was the most powerful or popular yoga teacher. He was on the cover of Sunday New York Times magazine. And then there was some scandal with his business and with some sex with students. He was single, they were married, and the hate, the abject hatred of a lot of his students who had spent years running around him as if he were like the baby Jesus, Like, how do you go from that much love and worship to that much hate? I remember trying to edit an article by one of his yoga teacher students that was just like pure hatred. And I was like, wow, you haven't even taken a second to process your own thoughts about anything. And maybe I was wrong, but Jesus. So just stop looking up to people, stop hating on people, and start trying to find workable solutions. Have some dignity. Remember that in Buddhism, like with samurai, we were taught to bow to one another with respect and friendliness. Not with worship, but respect and friendliness. Respect and friendliness make you feel dignified and cheerful. And we bow with our eyes open. So think about that one, and may theism be your new favorite word.